Thanks, Luke. You could have just finished up, but it's okay. So at this point, I'd like to welcome Tim. Tim is a UX researcher at Microsoft, and I am sure we're all going to enjoy the session. He doesn't know it, but he's my mentor in a way because I reach out to him once in a while when I'm stuck. So I'm excited to be here as well to just listen in. So at this point, Tim, if you're on the call, kindly unmute and take over.
Thank you very much, Glorious, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'll just start by sharing my screen. Can you all see my screen and the slides?
Yes, you can see it.
Yep. Okay, great. Yes, so as Glorious mentioned, I am Team Checker. I am a user experience designer at Microsoft, particularly focusing on search. Yeah, and so I'm actually just clocking my 1 year this month here at Microsoft. And before that, I was a product design lead at a company called Optimetrics, which makes sales automation software here in Nairobi, but serves Africa at large and South America and Europe as well. And so I worked there for about 2 years. And before that, I was an industrial designer at a company called Horn Product Design, of which is an industrial design consultancy in Melbourne. And so worked there for about 3 years. Yeah, so that's a bit about me. And so today I'll be talking about user research, particularly generative research, also known as exploratory research. And so I'd like to begin by walking you through a scenario. And so in this scenario, we were looking to learn how we can improve our product. And so we did user research whereby we asked users about the product, what they thought about it, its features, challenges experienced, what they thought can be improved. But then at the end of that research, when we were analyzing the data, we realized the responses we got were not very rich. And so we couldn't draw out much of meaningful insights from them. And so what we learned is that we missed out on learning about our users, uh, and or rather our customers before learning about our product. And when I talk about learning our users, I'm referring to learning about their lives, learning about their behaviors, their underlying problems, their most pressing needs, and their motivations. And through that, we would then be able to make sure that the improvements we made in the product met those underlying needs, and therefore the users would be able to get the most value from it. And so that is the essence of generative research. It is to give a deep understanding of who our customers are as humans before we can even think about the product. And you go about this by focusing on the users, or rather the customers and their behaviors, inquiring about their daily lives, and through this, you get rich insights on their goals, their motivations, and their needs. And you are able to uncover their deeper motivations behind why they use your product, or behind why they behave in a particular way when making decisions when using your product. And all in all, when you're doing generative research, you're starting from the problem space rather than jumping the gun and working backwards from the solution. Yeah, and so how do you go about conducting generative research? So the master plan of any research is a research plan. And this is a step-by-step document that you'll use throughout. And so in this research plan, what you need is background information about the project and the research, the objectives of the research, also known as the research questions. It is very important to know that the research questions are different from interview questions. I'll speak a bit more about that later. You also need to decide which users you want to interview and therefore how you're going to go about the recruiting. And finally, the meat of the research plan is the interview script, whereby you have the interview questions. And just again about the research questions, they're different from the interview questions. So the first one, background information, as we mentioned. So here you're giving the context of the research. So why are you doing the research? What is the research about? Yeah. And so a good example is we want to understand the reasons behind why certain customers are reordering at a higher frequency, as well as the barriers encountered by customers that prevent them from reordering on the platform. So in this example, you can see where we mention about we want to understand the reasons behind why certain customers are reordering. We cover the aspect of why we're doing the research, and where we mention about the platform used for reordering, we are covering the aspect of what the research is about. Research objectives, or rather research questions. So this is where you decide what you want to learn from the research as a whole. Yeah. What particular things do you want to learn? What larger overarching questions do you want to be answered? Yeah. Yeah, so examples of these are understand how and why users are currently reordering food on our app. Another example is discover the user's motivations behind reordering, both inside and outside of the app. And so these research objectives, or other research questions, are what will guide you later on when writing the interview questions. So as when the users are answering the interview questions, you can then later on cross-check and see whether all the questions answered by the users actually as a whole answer the research questions, or rather meet the research objectives. So how do you go about recruiting participants? So you need to decide what kind of participants you want. And you go about this through screener questions. And so screener questions are typically a survey that you give users before conducting the research, and you use that survey and the responses from that survey to shortlist the users that you're going to eventually interview. And so an example of a screener question is, when did you last buy something online? And the options that they can answer is within the past day, the past week, the past month, or more than a month ago. So in this example, say you want to interview users who frequently order online, yeah? So if that's the case, then when you get the responses, you'll probably rule out users who ordered more than a month ago because they don't order frequently, and only shortlist the users who ordered maybe within the past day or within the past week. Finally, the meat of the research, the interview script. So when writing interview questions, as mentioned before, a good way that it's a bit challenging to write them. It's a bit of a science, but a good way to go about it is to use the research questions, or rather the research objectives, and then break those down into interview questions, whereby The responses you expect to get from the interview questions should answer the research question, or rather meet the research objectives. And very important things to keep in mind when writing interview questions is, first of all, you should avoid priming users. So what do we mean by priming? So priming means that you influence users to answer in a particular way, or you make assumptions in your questions about those users. For example, you might ask a user, tell us uh, tell us how you like, or rather tell us why you like ordering from our app. So in this example, you are assuming that the users like your app, or rather you are suggesting to the users that they should like your app. So that is priming. You should also avoid leading questions, and leading questions is whereby you help the user to answer. So for example, you can ask a user, uh, tell us how you complete an order by clicking the checkout button. So in this example, by mentioning about clicking the checkout button, you have partly answered for the user, or you have told them part of the answer that they should give. Yeah. And then very important as well when writing interview questions is make sure that they are open-ended in order to get rich descriptive answers. And a good process, or rather approach to use, is one called the TEDW framing, whereby you begin the questions with phrases such as tell me about, explain how, describe why, or walk me through this particular process. And so some examples of good open-ended questions are, think about the last time you ordered takeaway on our website or rather app, and walk me through the entire process, starting with what sparked the idea. Another example of an open-ended question is describe the last time you struggled with reordering food. What was that like? And then follow up with another question of how did you solve the problem? And so that's how you get richer answers, so richer responses from questions. On the opposite of the spectrum, the opposite of open-ended questions, you have closed-ended questions, whereby, for example, you can ask a user, have you ever ordered takeaway on our app? They're likely to simply give an answer of yes or no, but there's not much you can learn from that answer. Yeah, or rather why they ordered or did it order from your app. And so it's always best to ask very open-ended questions. Yeah, and finally, about privacy. So this is something that gets overlooked too frequently, but it is a very critical thing. So first of all, in all research you do, all the data that you collect, all the information you collect about users, their responses, make sure that it is kept with the most strict confidence. Yeah. Make sure the information is confidential at all times, and you make it clear to everyone that it is confidential. But in the scenario whereby you need to share the responses of the data, say with your teammates, then first of all, you have to gain consent from the user, written consent, and in also make sure that you maintain the user's anonymity. So when you're sharing the data or the responses, do not use the user's names, real names, or any identifying information that someone can use to go online and just find out this is a user who gave this response. So for example, you can just refer to them as participant A or participant B, or if you want to maintain a more personal touch, then you can use fictitious names. But obviously, make sure when you're sharing the information, you inform the people you're sharing the information to that the names are fictitious. And finally, when conducting research, make sure you review and comply with global privacy standards. So, for example, the global data privacy rules from the UK. Yeah, so that is it from me. Um, Open to questions now.
I'm okay. As we wait for people to maybe think of questions or just internalize what you've taken us through, I have a question. So, how can you tell when a user is giving us incorrect data or feedback? Because a lot of times you find that users tell you what they think you want to hear, as opposed to giving you feedback that you can then use to inform your decisions and maybe drive the discussion forward. So, how can you tell when the feedback they're giving is not accurate?
It's a very, very good question. So, usually when conducting research, it's good to do what you call a contextual inquiry. So a contextual inquiry includes both interviews and observation. And you do interviews to get very straightforward answers that are more actionable, but it's also good to do the observation so that you can see what the users actually do. Because as you've mentioned, sometimes the users, it's not necessarily that they're giving knowingly giving false information. It might be just that they are not really aware of their experience, but by observing them using your product, you are able to firsthand see their experience and corroborate that with the responses they give to either validate or know whether if there are any contradictions, then probe deeper as to why. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes, thank you. And a follow up on that now. How can you make your participants feel comfortable to speak to you or even jump on a call or just agree to do the interview in the first place?
Again, wonderful question. So for that, it's good to always, when you're beginning the research, in fact, even before, when you reach out to the users for to do the research, when you begin the research and continually while you're conducting the research, always inform and remind the user that you are not testing them. This is not a test on them or and how good they are at your app. What you are testing is your app. So always reiterate that and remind the user so that you give them the confidence that you're not trying to judge them and their abilities. What you are trying to do is to assess your product or your app and the experience about around it. Does
Mhm.
that answer?
Yes, yes, it does. Thank you. So at this point, I'd like to invite anyone on the call. Kindly just raise your hand if you have any question, even if you just want to know how research is done at any of the companies that Tim had mentioned he worked at or where he is currently. Feel free to ask as well.
I have a question for Tim.
Hi, Whitney.
Hi, Glorious.
Yes, please go ahead and ask.
Which is the best way for conduct interviews, like one-on-one questionnaires? Like, which is the best possible way to get genuine feedback from?
Hmm. Okay. So you have so within user research, you have qualitative and quantitative research. Within quantitative research, you have methods such as questionnaires, surveys, metrics, analytics, such methods. On the other spectrum, you have qualitative research, whereby you have methods such as interviews, observation, usability studies as well. And so it depends on the type of data you want. So for example, if you want very direct data that you can measure, then quantitative methods such as surveys, and questionnaires are more appropriate. But if you want feedback that is more honest and rich, then qualitative is preferable. And so, for example, interviews and observation. And going back to what I mentioned before about getting more accurate and honest responses, combining both interviews and observation in the method called contextual inquiries is preferable, whereby you ask users open-ended questions. And when you ask them open-ended questions, it's less likely that you'll lead them or influence them to answer in a particular way. You just give them the space and room to answer how they feel. And in addition to that, when you conduct the observation, you're able to see firsthand how the experience is for them. Does that answer, Whitney?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Sure. Oh, I see Millicent's hand is up.
Hi, team.
Okay.
So my question is, so you're working in a startup and things are changing rapidly, or you have tight deadlines. How do you go about making sure that you're beating these deadlines and conducting extensive research? And then the other question is research a one-time thing? Like, at what point do you conduct user research? And is it a continuous process or is it just a one-time thing?
Okay. Yeah. Cool. So in terms of deadlines, yeah, this is something that I think every UXer struggles with. But something I've learned over my years of experience is that communicating the value of research is part of our job. And it's understandable because in the same way that we might not understand a lot of the value of a lot of the things that engineers need to do or PMs need to do, in the same way other disciplines might not understand the value as to why we need to conduct extensive research. And so it's a good skill to learn how to communicate why we need to do research to begin with and why time and resources need to be invested in that, even though there's a tight deadline. Um, Completing the project within 1 month, in extreme cases, just because, you didn't do research, is going to be more costly in the long run as compared to investing just an additional month for research. Yeah, and so it's a good skill to learn as researchers how to communicate that, the value of research, and so as to be able to get enough resources in terms of time or headcount to conduct the research. Um, to answer your second question in terms of when, so this first part of the talk today was generative research. I think other methods are usability studies. So I think that will be covered by Ruben in the next session, if I'm not wrong, when you will confirm. But it's a continuous process. So generative research is good to do at the beginning of the project before you do any design, so that you can understand the user and understand the problem before trying to create the solution. And when you understand the problem in and out, then you're able to improve the solution, or the likelihood of your solution being appropriate to the user and having greater value to the user. But now, once you've done that and you've done explorations and concepts, then now you can do more. You can continue doing them, more research, maybe in the form of usability studies, or contextual inquiries as well. whereby you show users the concepts, ask them questions around that, and assess the experience with those concepts if you have prototypes. And with each iteration, when you get the response from the users, make improvements on the concepts, go back to them and get further feedback. So that is to refine the product. So it's a continuous process. I see Robert's hand up. Sorry, does that answer your question, first of all? You can still hear me?
Yes, you can hear you. I think she dropped off.
Okay. Okay. Robert, do you want to go next?
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, so my question was in relation to an article I had read. In the article, they stated that for some users, especially some that are not comfortable disclosing some of the information, that you may need to compensate them so that they may be at least comfortable with answering some of your questions. So my question was, should you disclose this information before or after engaging them in either the interview or the survey? And will this be a sort of leading method that will limit the amount, will limit their openness to answer your questions?
Okay. So whether or not you should pay users for when doing the research, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. No, I think it's not leading. It's actually a good practice if it's a simple concept of compensating people for their time and effort. So, users in this case are sacrificing their time and effort to help you improve your product and therefore make more money. So it's only fair that you compensate them for their time. And in addition to this also improves their motivation to give you the most open, the most honest answers that they feel would actually improve your product. If they are not motivated, then they'll tell you what you want to hear so that they can get over with the research as quickly as possible. That's just my opinion. But in the case whereby you pay them, they're more motivated to put more time and effort in answering your questions and giving you the best responses possible. Does that answer, Robert?
I had a follow-up question to that. Should you disclose it before or after engaging them?
Okay, I think before, just for the sake of transparency.
Okay, thank you.
At least that's what we do. That's what we've done in the past. Yeah, you disclose it before.
Thank you. My question has been.
And just to add to that, that's why the screener questions are important, so that you don't just get participants who want money, but participants who are actually going to be useful for your research. Cool. Joseph, you have your hand up.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Thanks. So, hi team. So I have two questions. So the first one is kind of like a scenario I'm at the moment. Like I have a gig with an organization, and I would love to kind of do this qualitative and quantitative research with the users, but I'm getting this challenge of like they're saying it would be a bit hectic getting permission from their customers to conduct this interview. So what's your view on this to avoid like me being a designer and being biased on the design of like designing it with my own view? Then the other question is in terms of the platform survey, we kind of like chip in the interview that you have done, or kind of like creating the empathy. An example is like Dovetail. So which platform do you kind of like, would you propose maybe designers to use? I've kind of used Dovetail, but on your perspective, maybe which platform do you use to kind of like subdivide the research that you have done with the interviewers? Yeah, so that's all.
Okay. Yeah, so first to go back to your first question, goes back to what I was talking about, learning to communicate the value of research. I think over time, the more you design, and where eventually when you get the opportunity to do the research, you discover very quickly how much time you would have lost later on if you didn't do the research, in terms of maybe trying to solve the wrong problem and solving the problem in the wrong way as well. So here in Microsoft, we have the mantra of build the right thing in the right way. Yeah. And so the idea behind that is, before you come up with a solution, you need to understand the problem in and out. That way, in the long run, if you invest months of design and engineering and ship only to discover you were solving the wrong problem, and you discover that by no one buying your product, or you getting, yes, people buying, but then you do not have any retention, um, you will have lost 100% of everything, of all that time you invested, just because you decided not to invest 10% more to do the research. And so a good way of communicating to users, to stakeholders, being your company, on the value of research is look at examples of products. Just go online and search for examples of products which failed, or companies which failed, because when they shipped their product, they were not solving the right problem. And the reason, if they did research, they would have discovered very early on that we need to pivot and solve this other problem. Or even if they decided to stick to that problem, then they'd, through the research, figure out this is the best way to solve this problem, instead of making assumptions. And when you do thorough research, personally, 100% of the times I've done research, I have discovered, sometimes all, sometimes some, but in 100% of the time I've done it, a number of the assumptions that we had, not just that myself and our team had, were wrong. And that's the nature of human beings, is we make a lot of assumptions, and we just ignore them in daily life because they're not that expensive to, if we end up being wrong. But a lot of the times assumptions are wrong. And when it comes to the case of you putting money against those assumptions, then you're likely going to lose money, and you can save yourself from that failure, but by just investing in a little bit more of time to do the research. So yeah, you can look at do research and try find companies which failed because they didn't do the research. On the other hand, try find companies which are very successful and look at the research that they've done. A good example, you can dig around on what Airbnb have done. I think they have a design blog, airbnb.design, and see the type of research they've done, and how that communicated, or rather directed the solution that they created, and present that to your stakeholders. This is what you get when you don't do research, likelihood of failure, and on this other end, this is what you get when you do the research. Your second question was the platform. So for us, we use user testing. It depends on your size of company. Some of the platforms can be very expensive. So for example, user testing, the one we use, I think it's a bit costly. If you're in a startup, then just going out in the field and speaking to users face to face is a good cheap way. If you have to do it remotely, then just using Google Hangouts, that's still an option. But if you can afford the other tools, then user testing is a good one. So user testing helps you with recruiting, putting out the screener questions to recruit, conducting the interviews, doing usability studies as well. And in addition to recording the sessions, it also transcribes the sessions through AI. And in addition to that, transcribing the answers, sorry, that the users give, it also highlights like positive remarks that they make. It does that automatically, and negative remarks. And so you're able to quickly go and find the positive insights or the negative insights that users give. Does that answer your question?
Yes, the first question, I think that's well and good, and thanks for that. I mean, for the second question, what I meant is after doing the research, you kind of like need to kind of like break down the research. I didn't mean like the platform should do the research, but rather the platform to kind of like subdivide the research, like Dovetail. Using Dovetail, you just upload maybe the interview you had done, then it kind of like you can kind of like subdivide it and be able to kind of like create an empathy map using it. So maybe I wanted if you could maybe tell us an alternative for that.
Okay.
I don't know if my question is very clear.
Yeah. Okay. I think probably for that, not. Yeah. Sorry, I misunderstood the first time.
No.
But we personally, in the past, we don't go as far as creating empathy maps. When we do the research and do the analysis from the recordings or from the responses, we just collect the insights and then use those insights to direct and drive the design that we do, without necessarily coming up with empathy maps. So I might not be able to answer that question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Gloria?
Mine is going to be a bit personal, but feel free to use another example if you want to. So I like learning from UXers in the field, and you definitely have a lot of experience. So I wanted to learn or hear from you. What's the one time you failed to ask the right question, or you failed as a researcher in one way or another, and the impact of that to the business? Or if there's any time um, your team made a decision that affected the business. Or you can use another example of a different product. It doesn't have to be you.
Okay. Wow. Nothing comes up. I'm sure there are several scenarios, but nothing comes up at my finger point right now. I'd have to reflect and think about it. But if I can recall, and this has happened multiple times, I just can't recall what exactly happened. It was just around asking open-ended versus closed-ended questions. Sometimes you would end up with closed-ended questions, or even actually closed-ended and leading questions, and not because you were intending to. It's simply because one thing you learn and one thing you need to adapt to as a researcher is once you hit the field, your plan on the research goes out of the window because there's so many factors when you're outside in the field. When you're just sitting in front of your computer in the office or at home, you have control of what you're doing in terms of design. But when you have other people involved, you taking into consideration their context, where they are, what they're doing. There are so many other factors that influence how your research goes, and so you have to adapt and ask the questions in a different way. Maybe when you're asking the questions, they are not really giving useful answers, and so you have to ask a bit more questions, probe them. But sometimes when asking those, making those adaptations and asking those questions, I would later on realize that I asked a leading question because I hadn't planned on it, and so the question that just came out of my mouth was a leading question, and yeah, uh, as a result, yeah, the response was not what it should have been from the user. So that's just an example of something that has happened a few times. Yeah, but a natural, direct example, I'm not sure I can think of one right now, but I hope that's a bit useful.
Yeah, that's okay. So there's still a couple more questions on the chat section, so maybe you can go through them as well.
Sure.
Okay.
Great. Okay, so I'm seeing one from Collins. When conducting interviews for people in different demographics, how could one maintain user interest in completing a virtual type of interview? Good question. This goes back to the question. The answer was actually answered before by one of you, I think, Ephraim, and that is to compensate the users, so give them an incentive to complete the interview. That's one way of doing so. Another way of doing so is making sure the interviews are favorable to the user in that they're not long, the questions are not difficult, and the questions don't discourage them by making them feel as if they have failed or they don't know how to use your product. Yeah, you'll find people are more than willing to help typically, especially when they initially give that consent that they want to help. Once they start doing so and they realize that the responses are giving are helpful to you, and so that's something you should also communicate by body language and vocally as well when interviewing users. Uh, Encourage them when they answer, show them that, and even tell them that the answer they have given is helpful, and that motivates them in addition to obviously the incentive that you give them. Robert asks, okay, I think we've answered that. Yeah, I think it was the same with Robert and Ephraim. Yeah, good. Any Robert and Ephraim, can you confirm whether your questions are the ones we discussed earlier? Okay. Collins. Okay, great. Collins, did I answer your question satisfactorily? Right. Yeah. Any other questions from anyone?
I have a quick one. It has nothing to do with what we've covered today, but I just want to know from you, what is the one highlight of being a UXer for you? What's the one time you really felt like your role was appreciated? And what can UXers do to make more people aware of what exactly they do? Apart from just having sessions and speaking about what they do, what can they do different to ensure that the business understands their value?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, the first question I'd say for me, it's solving problems, and that's one of the reasons why research is important. When you don't do research and you just design, you're not really sure, you're not really 100% confident that what you design is solving someone's problem. But when you conduct the research and this is really a problem, and once you go ahead and design, the design process is actually enjoyable because this solution that I am creating is going to solve so and so's problem that we uncovered when we interviewed them. And that for me in itself is very fulfilling. Solving people's problems that we have validated and we know really exist. Yeah, and so I'd say that's the main thing for me. Your second question on communicating the value is, I think this goes back to, there are two aspects. There's the aspect of the research as well, what I mentioned before about learning how to communicate the value of research. In addition to that as well, learn how to communicate the value of design. A good resource to use for this is InDesign blog. I think it's a blog by, let me just find it and share the link. They have a lot of articles and anecdotes from corporations and designers around the value of design. Let me just try to find it. And so first of all, again, to what I mentioned before about solving a problem, if you can identify this as a problem and then at the end of it show this design solves this customer's problem, that in itself validates that the design has value for the customer. Yeah, so that's one way of communicating the value. The other way of communicating the value of designers is when you're talking about the work that you're doing, refrain from talking about how the product looks or the design looks or the aesthetics. Always focus on the user, their needs, investigating their needs, how you're going to meet those needs, their problems, how you're going to solve those problems, because that is where the value of design is. All these other things such as aesthetics or even interactions, animations, all those additional things are just a means to an end. They're just tools that you use within the design in order to solve the problem. And so just focus on solving the problem. So for example, when someone asks me what I do as a designer, I never tell them I use color or this or that or layout, all those things. I just communicate that my job is to understand the users and their problems and to create a solution that solves those problems. And you create that solution through different design methods. If they want to learn more, then you can discuss in detail these different design methods, visual design, prototyping and all that. But the essence of design is solving a problem. So make sure whenever you're communicating about design, you're communicating that and reiterating that. Does that partly answer your question?
Yes, it does. I have a follow-up question, but first I'd like to hear from Sally. Maybe you could just unmute and ask your question first.
So my question lies in, what if while doing the research, the biggest problem with users is the aesthetics of the product or software?
Yeah,
Can that be an issue in the field?
Oh yeah, absolutely, it can. But again, there's a within aesthetics, what exactly is it? Is it a question of accessibility? Is it that the contrast between the text and the background is not good enough? Then that goes beyond aesthetics. That's what do you call it? That's accessibility. Yeah. So yes, those can be issues, and definitely those are things you want to learn, and when you're doing research around a concept, and yeah, solve them as well.
Okay.
So just to answer that, when say a user says your product does not look good, you should try. Don't just take that answer as it is. Probe them and ask them why. Ask them why. Keep asking them why, so that you understand exactly what do they mean. Is it that the color is too bright and hurting their eyes? Is it that the font is too small and you can't see it? Is it that the spacing is too little and everything is just crammed together? Um, and so just dig deeper into responses to try and understand the underlying problem. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. So I guess you can take maybe one more question from anyone else because we have a minute to go. As we're all thinking. My question was, what's the right number of participants to have or to recruit when you're doing user research? Can you speak to 10 people, and is the data that you collect valid enough to inform the decisions of the business, or what's the threshold?
That's a very good question. It depends on the type of research you're doing, whether quantitative or qualitative. If you're doing quantitative, if you're doing surveys and questionnaires and analytics, whereby you're trying to measure something, then the greater the number, the better. So if you can get 50 responses upwards, that's good. But when you're doing qualitative, it can be very difficult to handle large numbers, and the response that you get might be overwhelming to analyze, and so it might just discourage you from doing research as a whole. So if you're doing qualitative research such as interviews or observation, a good rule of thumb is between 5 to 10. Typically, you can start with 5 users, and then after interviewing those 5 users, if you realize, you check whether the answers they've given to the interview questions meet the research objectives. Remember the research goals, the research questions, overarching research questions. If the responses those 5 users are giving to the interview questions help you meet the research objectives, then that's enough. If the 5 users don't give enough, if their responses don't answer your questions enough, then first of all, look at the questions that you have, revisit them and see if you can reframe them. If that doesn't help, then you can consider recruiting more users. But the ideal number is 5 to 10. Is begin with 5 and then maybe later on increase to 10 if you need to. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. But I'm curious. For Microsoft, for instance, you're building for more than 1 million people. Can 5 people be enough to inform the decisions if they say they don't like the search and most of them are saying they don't like the position of where the search is? Can they inform the decision that you make?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, typically
Absolutely.
all our research, I can't think all the research I've personally been involved in, I think the maximum we've had was about 9 or 10. Yeah. And what you'll see is, you can't please anyone. So if you get 100 users, 25 tell you that your background should be blue, 25 tell you your background should be green, 25 tell you yellow, 25 tell you red. What do you go with? And so that's why asking open-ended questions is very important. And regardless of the type of responses users give, the deeper you dig to the responses, you'll realize from a small pool, the underlying problem is the same. If a user says the search bar should be on the left, honestly, that's not really a good response, or that's not even a question you should ask them where. You shouldn't ask them where the search bar should be. Instead, you should ask more open-ended questions. So if they say they don't like where the search bar is, then you ask them why. Why don't they like where the search bar is? Is it that it is difficult to see it there? And the same, another user might say they don't like, they prefer the search bar to be bigger. There is, again, you ask why. And the more you ask why, you discover finally, when you get to the underlying issue, it is more consistent across the users, regardless of the first response they gave.
I totally hear you. I get it now. Thank you. Before you leave, Tim, if you don't mind, could you answer the question that has been asked by Collins?
What's
On
the
the chat
entry-level
section.
designer? Okay, yeah. What's the entry-level designer-based purpose to a company? Could you go with designer alone or both design researcher? And how would one use this identifier starting salary, say, during an interview? So it depends on the size of the company. For smaller companies, then and it depends what kind of designer you are. If you're a UX designer, then part of your skill set should be research. If you're just focused on visual design, then research is not necessary. So for example, so I guess in smaller companies whereby having the resources to pay a researcher and a visual designer separately might be challenging, then it makes more sense to have a UX designer who does both. But in bigger companies, you'll find that they have both. So for example, here in Microsoft, we have visual designers, we have researchers, and we have UX designers. So the visual designers work, both the visual designers and the UX designers mostly do the same work. But typically you'll find that if there's a research project, if a project needs research, then the visual designer has to work with a researcher. But in smaller projects within the company, within bigger companies, a UX designer can conduct both the research and the design independently without involving a researcher. And so that increases their value. And I think one of the advice I always give about standing out is being able to communicate in interviews and in your CV, in your resume, and in your portfolio that you can do research. Yeah. Because not enough people, that's one of the things when in the past I've conducted recruiting in the previous company. What I realized, a lot of the designers, they were not able to, or rather the applicants, they were not able to communicate their ability or their experience and skill set in research. And so whoever was able to strongly communicate their skill set in research and their experience with examples, and they clearly stood out. So that increases your value in terms of being more employable. And even here in Microsoft as well, UX designers are paid more than visual designers. So increases your value in terms of being more in demand, and also in terms of being able to demand higher compensation, or rather, request for higher compensation. Does that answer your question, Collins? Can you still hear me?
Yes, they can. He's responded on chat.
Yeah, so this is, I'll just share a link of a good resource around the value of design. So you can check that out. I've just done the search and shared results filtered on that search around value of design within InVision. I have a lot of articles around that. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much for joining us today, team, and scheduling time out of your busy schedule to be here. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to meeting you when you'll be having our physical session and just interacting with you. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And yeah, thank you for the awesome questions, and yeah, for making time to attend today.
Thank you.
Tim.